Hi, everyone. My name is Tammy. I'm the co-founder of And Humanity, an inclusive content agency, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm very excited to have Majid Khoury, a branding advertising research strategist and advisor to And Humanity.
Great. Well, thank you, Tammy. My name is Majid Khoury, as Tammy mentioned, and I go by he, him. And I'm so glad that we're chatting about this, Tammy. And, we've been working together in one way or another. So
Yeah.
I'm really glad for years now. So I'm really glad to be part of the End Humanity Initiative.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and share your wealth of knowledge. Majid has worked with amazing brands across and is such a resource to any organization. I highly recommend him. So today, Majid and I will be basically talking about return on investment for diversity and inclusion marketing, some of the barriers and challenges that brands have entering the space. So before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge we operate on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So let's start off with a little bit about yourself first. So how did you get into this line of work? And you have a wealth of experience in this area. So if you could just give us a little bit of background on that, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, I stumbled on market research by fluke, to be honest with you. That was around 30 years ago or so when it wasn't such a popular kind of topic in the world of marketing. So I've always wanted to get into advertising. And then a market researcher was looking for a student to help out with interviews. So I was recommended, did the interviews, loved the work. They hired me as soon as I graduated and then worked with them. It was a company specializing in advertising research back in Montreal and Toronto called Tandemar, which is now part of Ipsos. And then moved here to Vancouver in the 90s, had my own firm that was then purchased by Ipsos. And for the last 9 years now, I've been working completely on my own from my home and really enjoying it. So I've been in it for a long time, and I've touched a lot of brands across North America and some global brands and a lot of the local market businesses as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Majid, it's been so amazing working with you. I think just working with you, I've learned so much about the industry as well. One of the first questions I'd like to ask you is that, there seems to be quite a few roadblocks or fears when it comes to brands entering the D&I space. Do you feel that those fears are founded or unfounded, and what are some of these fears?
Great. There are fears. They're probably founded, but doesn't mean that they can't be overcome.
Mhm.
So there's two areas that I feel is a real issue when it comes to this. Is first, a full understanding by the marketers about diversity and inclusiveness. What does it mean? How to go about it, etc. For example, do these marketers really understand that different diverse groups are also diverse within themselves? So let's
Mhm.
try to understand the
Yes.
diversity within a segment.
Mhm.
Do they understand their feelings and attitudes as they vary across these segments? So a lot of that understanding and sensitivity, I feel it's kind of missing. And if
Mhm.
anything, I'll be sharing some examples. And I thought about some of these examples, and they all go back around over 10 years ago. So it seems like we were doing it better. And now it's just with everything that the challenges of marketing in general is getting less. For example, I remember, probably some people remember back in the 90s, Van City was the first financial institutions in probably North America that targeted the gay and lesbian
Mhm.
community at that point. Their research wasn't talking to just gays and lesbians to understand the thing. They segmented that group into those living downtown, those living in the eastern suburbs, and those all the way in Fraser Valley,
Mhm.
because they realized that you can't talk to all gays and lesbians in the same way. Someone who's
Mhm.
living downtown is completely different attitudes and life stage and openness or not compared to a gay and lesbian living in Fraser Valley. So that's an example of the thinking that is required. This what that cultural intelligence that we need to think about.
Mhm.
We also see it a lot in terms of the looking at it as a separate market. Given
Mhm.
that I worked in Montreal and Toronto in the past working on national brands, I feel every marketer in this country understands that you can't just go into Quebec, up an ad, and run with it. It just doesn't
No.
work. So you got that sensitivity when it comes to something like that. So why don't we apply it within diverse groups of other languages?
Mhm.
Why do we have ads, and these are really examples without naming the clients, where an ad that is filmed with a Chinese origin individual uh, in Mandarin, that same individual whose mother tongue is Mandarin also dubbed the ad into Cantonese. Well,
Mhm.
the Cantonese speakers picked up on the accent. The research showed the ad didn't do as well. Uh,
Mhm.
Other situations I come across all the time is an ad is actually in English and
Mhm.
uh, originally with a Caucasian character, and then it gets dubbed into
Mhm.
Chinese. I mean, it just feels that there isn't this strong sense of understanding the nuances of
Mhm.
diversity and inclusiveness marketing. They
Mhm.
understand the benefit of it. I mean, we all know market and you need to attract them, but it's these nuances that's one of these
Mhm.
could be roadblocks.
Mhm.
The other one is budgets.
Mm.
Well, it's not really budget, it's return on investment for the money.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is really tricky to measure,
Mhm.
and but at the same time there are ways to do it. I mean, some of the studies I've seen from the US only like last year where
Yeah.
they analyzed like brands who include different groups in their advertising, their stock values tended to be like 44% higher than
Mhm.
other brands, and their brand preference was 83% higher than brands that do not focus on inclusivity and diversity in their advertising. So the ROI is there, but people think, oh my God, we can't figure it out. So I
Mhm.
think it's sort of these kinds of roadblocks that I feel are really holding us back to do a really good job.
Completely. It's very frustrating as a marketer when a brand comes to you and says, "Oh, my target is the Chinese audience," and you just sit there and you're thinking, okay, are you talking about first generation, second generation? Are you talking, Taiwanese, Cantonese, maybe Singaporean? Like what? How do you break that down? And it's looping or grouping people into these mass categories where you're really not building that authentic relationship. And that's quite frustrating from a marketer's perspective when
Definitely.
you're presented with a brief that's maybe not as culturally um, literate as it could be, and to your point around budgets and looking for the ROI as well, we've been seeing a lot more information and research come out in that area, including customer loyalty, increased customer loyalty when it comes to more inclusive brands as well. It's very exciting to see that research is coming out and actually backing that up now. Do you have examples of ways to kind of work around some of these roadblocks? These are clearly ones that can be overcome with just a bit of tweaking, it sounds like. Can you walk through some of these solutions that we could use to overcome these?
Definitely. I mean, the first adaptation of the creative to the target is really key. And that's something that no dubbing would do. It doesn't mean that you have to film a very expensive ad. You have to think of the story and the objective and the messaging from the perspective of that group.
Mhm.
Uh, Around, again, an old example is around 10 years ago, Coast Capital Savings television ads, probably many people in BC remember them. They're fun, humor, etc. When they started advertising on the Punjabi television, they produced ads that were completely different in terms of the look and the scenario than the English ads, but they still had the same fun humor of
Mhm.
uh, the culture. And I mean, if you look those up on Google, they are hilarious because they have like the actors are from Punjabi backgrounds. They're
Mhm.
having certain jokes that we may not relate to, but they're obviously related to the culture. So that for me is a way to do it. You don't have to go that far. I mean, it's just probably they got two of, I don't know, but I mean, you just need two actors having a scenario, but the scenario is written in the right context to make it adaptable. It's things along those lines that are really
Mhm.
going to make a difference in doing it.
Mhm.
When it comes to, again, something as simple as thinking about it, like, do we include our target in the advertising that we see? I think all of us have seen ads from local advertisers that try to include all of those uh, individuals, whether it's gays and lesbian backgrounds, trans community, Chinese, Indian, etc., or South Indian, but we don't necessarily see enough of them.
Mhm.
Again, it's a group called Heat in the US did this analysis of
Mhm.
monthly ads or so, and they found that across all the ads, only 1% of the ads depicted gays and lesbian community, only 1% depicted disabled
Mhm.
individuals. And their discussion was, well, when you think of the general population, I mean, depending on how we measure it, at least 10% belong to the gay and lesbian uh, QT plus groups.
Mhm.
But why only 1% of the ads reflect that?
Mhm.
4% of the general population are disabled. Why don't we have as much reflection? And this
Mhm.
doesn't even take into account the over indexing of purchasing power, for example, of some of these groups, etc.
Mhm.
So it's just thinking about some of these things. And again, another way to overcome it is to think of it in the same context as you market to the general population. I mean, you own an ad agency, you understand how these things work. I mean, we all know media buys have to be substantial to achieve a reach at a good level to create an impact. That doesn't seem to be applied to
Mhm.
some of these campaigns. I mean, I look at some of the spending levels. I mean, they're barely 1% of total impressions in in the lower mainland, for example, go to 4 different ethnic groups.
Is
It
it
doesn't
fair to
work.
say that the reflection of the population is definitely not reflected in the media buy budget distribution?
It's definitely not reflected. And also from a pure logic, the
Mhm.
numbers in absolute become very, very small to even do something.
Mhm. To have any impact, it's
And
almost better not to do anything at all unless you're gonna
exactly,
do it
it's
well.
like, don't spread it over, uh, 4 languages, even like 5. I mean, to be honest with you, some discussions with advertisers, I mean, we talk about the Cantonese, about the Mandarin speaking, about the Hindi speaking, about the Punjabi speaking, about uh, the English speaking, like, it starts going on
Yes.
and on. And we haven't even got into newcomers within the culture versus not,
Mhm.
etc. You can't
Mhm.
advertise to all of them
Mhm.
and have enough money to do so. So focus on one and or two and do it properly.
Yeah, and that's part of the question that we had around marketing budgets with the brand. How much of your budget should you invest into, technically it's named as, a minority group, but I mean, by 2036, it'll be a minority majority country. We already are minority majority in Vancouver and a lot of major cities. Um, how should the budget be broken up when you say, oh, here's, the mass population advertising versus these minority groups? Given this information, how should the budget be broken up?
I mean, the starting point is to say, if you want to include them as part of your target market,
Hmm.
spend on them in proportion to their presence.
Mm, mm,
I mean, you think of lower mainland general target.
hmm.
Yes, there's at least to 20% or so of one of the different Chinese speaking
Hmm.
heritages or languages. And then let's assume 10% of those would be reached by your general English stations, given they've been here a lot longer, or maybe they don't speak the language as well, etc. So that means you need to invest at least 10% of your budget to reach the others
Mm-hmm.
to start with. But all the numbers I'm seeing is investing between 3 to 1% of the budget
Mm-hmm.
towards even bigger groups than just the Cantonese and Mandarin speaking. So when you start doing it that way, then you say, okay, well, now let's work it backwards.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I have $5 million to spend. What happens if I take 10% of that and dedicate it to that or to that group, and then take the rest to the others, and then decide where you want to focus on, what you could cut without jeopardizing impact.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yes, because right now, currently, what we're seeing a lot of is tokenism or representation when it comes to posters or billboards and whatnot. But I wouldn't say that's true inclusion. When it comes to that, it's actually investing in, say, content that's relatable to that community specifically, and so that requires more than just the 1 or 2% that's currently being invested, right? So we're looking at deeper content, specifically authentic to that whichever community you're targeting, and that can, because of the complex intersections of every individual, you can break it up by age, sexual orientation, people of color, and so depending, I guess, on the way you want to, I guess, for lack of a better term, cut up the population,
exactly, yeah.
different ways to relate to different parts of an individual's identity. hmm So, in terms of the role of market research, what role can it play when it comes to D&I marketing and advertising?
I mean, I feel the key role, and I apply that in all advertising research, to say, where you want to spend your money is at the strategy phase,
Mm-hmm.
understanding your market, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel that a good place for it where market research can play a great role is understanding the market, their attitudes, the nuances, which you don't really get by just reading.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
reading
You don't get to know people by purely, numbers, right? Or
Exactly. So you need to spend time with them and talk to them. And what I see is that doesn't happen. Most of the money spent on research for ethnic groups is sort of at the other side, at least in the advertising, where they're evaluating the performance. But
mm-hmm.
by then it's too late. You already
Mm-hmm.
like adopt the ad, which you shouldn't do. You've already, talking about things that are irrelevant, as you said, which you
Mm-hmm.
should do, etc. So you need to start digging deeper. I mean, the Van City example with the gays and lesbians was one.
Mm-hmm.
And another example I worked on a while ago was, for example, the Mink Pal paper. When they first came into the city kind of thing, they didn't just talk to one group. They talked to the new arrivals from mainland China, to the established from Hong Kong, to the Taiwanese, and they really got those different understanding
Mm-hmm. The
before they
nuances,
went
yeah.
out to develop a strategy. So it's definitely a place where market research is not used as much. And of course, evaluation becomes key, especially if we're now jumping from spending, you know, $20,000 on that group for advertising to $500,000 or something like
Yeah.
that, then you need to invest in evaluation. It's the same concept. So I feel it's definitely not used, but it has a place in it as
Absolutely.
much as anyone else. Now, I'm not a political or policy researcher, so I really can't speak to it. But I bet you all these political parties and government entities, they're spending a lot of money researching those groups because they need the votes. So why don't we think of it that way?
Completely. And I think there's a really popular phrase that marketers really haven't embodied entirely, which is nothing about us without us. And really, the engagement portion means meaningful conversations, authentic representation, and that all requires building relationships from very early on. And in order to do that, you have to integrate them from the strategy phase to the creative phase and so on and so forth. So I think that's a really great point. So what are some of the challenges that market researchers are having with supporting D&I? Because there definitely are some systemic challenges that come with our industry when it comes to supporting D&I. Can you tell me a little bit about challenges that we currently face?
I mean, we face challenges in terms of accessing this market for market research basis. As you probably know, there's all these online panels, people agree to be on survey. They take a lot of effort to represent the population of Canada at large. So you could get to French Canadians
Mhm.
easily. But then when it comes to some of the other ethnic groups, for example, they're not identified properly, and there aren't enough of them. And that's not surprising, because if half of some of the ethnic groups do not necessarily consume English media, they're not going to be comfortable doing surveys in English. So they won't be on the panel. So we're missing out on them. So that access is not there. There are some providers who give you respondents who speak the language, but then there aren't enough of them, or they only cover maybe a couple of languages, but not all the ethnic groups.
Mhm.
Trying to find a gay and lesbian panel,
Mhm.
I'm not sure how easy it is to
Yeah.
find pre-identified, but again, one could think creatively. It's like, you could go through influencers that target
Mhm.
those groups and try to promote your survey there. So there's different ways, but there isn't enough thinking about it, which goes back, there isn't enough investment in it that needs to be
Mhm.
for
The
market
vicious
research
cycle that kind of keeps going.
do it. Yeah, it has to be cited. So there's that part which starts increasing the cost. The
Mhm.
other thing is the translation cost starts adding up, because
Mhm.
you're not only translating a survey, you're programming it
Mhm.
in some sort of language,
Mhm.
and then you also need to translate it back to
Mhm.
English to analyze what they're responding. So before you know it, you end up with a price tag that's almost 30% higher to
Yeah.
reach one of those groups than it is for general population. And then you transfer that to back to the money that they
Mhm.
spent on it, then it becomes, oh my God, I'm spending
Mhm.
40% of my media budget
Mhm.
on research. No, just go and buy more media in that case.
Completely. It's understandable just because, it's, the law of supply and demand. And it's partly why And Humanity formed to create, a bit more of a network, a more of a community so that we have access to these communities and have the cultural nuance and literacy so that we can better understand these communities as well. But that's going to take time and effort on behalf of our entire industry, not just one individual or a team of individuals. And part of it is growing that community. Do you have any suggestions on ways to work around that, or just go for it anyways, keep investing? Like, what are your thoughts around that?
I mean, it becomes back to that chicken and egg is, if you keep at it, you're going to start finding more qualified people
Hmm.
that understand it in the industry. You're going to start seeing more courses, education around it. That, but we need to start by making a commitment
Hmm.
as marketers. Is to say, as you use the word token, kind of thing is, to really say or understand that it's a waste of money to just touch this, or to just throw a bunch of people from different backgrounds on a poster. It's
Hmm.
beyond that. Once we get there, then we start have to work backwards. I
Hmm.
mean, some smart marketers in the city think to say, well, I know it's costing me more than it's worth, but how else can I make a business case for this?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's an investment, and the investment would pay off afterwards once you understand it. But I think it all has to come all together. I mean,
Hmm.
uh, the proportion of courses in some of the business schools that are on digital marketing versus multicultural international marketing is kind of a joke. And again, I mean, when I went to school, I took like 3 courses in international marketing, communications, and cultural communications, etc. So I feel it's just not on our radar. It
Mhm,
should
mhm.
be.
It definitely is becoming more and more on our radar as brands, leaders in this industry that are pushing for inclusivity are really seeing amazing returns in that area. I think part of the conversation is just understanding that, you know, when you invest in these groups first, and are one of the pioneers, the customer loyalty you're building is amazing, because there is this understanding that you've taken a risk to reach out to our community, that, you know, you've invested in getting to know us, and therefore you build a relationship that you can't otherwise in a blanket um, campaign, right?
Yeah.
Mhm. In terms of, just to kind of wrap up here a little bit, would you have any kind of tips or suggestions or last things to kind of say to brands when it comes to entering the D&I space, and you know, what to do as a first step when coming into market research?
I think the first step is, even if it's casual research, understand the market. Don't just talk to your employees who are from that group. They are not necessarily representative.
Mhm,
Understand the market, understand the nuances, do
mhm,
some of these things. So that for me is the starting
mhm.
point. And then start going through it just like any marketing. Let's focus on primary target, secondary target.
Yes.
This is who they are. Define them properly. Don't define them as Cantonese speaking Vancouverites.
Go a little deeper than that since it's a
Yeah,
little bit more complex. Well, thank you so much, Majid, for your time with us, for sharing your knowledge. So, where can people find you if they want more information, if they want to build some solid market research and strategy?
sure. I mean, I could be reached at my email, which is strategy@majidkhoury.com.
Mhm.
Is easy, or via phone 604-725-5892. Or they can talk to you. I'm sure you can find me for that.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll find Majid all over the internet as well. He has a fantastic blog as well. If you guys haven't, you can just easily Google his name, and it'll pop up. But as an audience, if you have any questions, you're interested in joining our community, you want to share some of your knowledge, help push for more inclusion in our industry, please reach out and contact us. You can find all our contact information at andhumanity.ca. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Tammy. We'll talk soon. Bye.